This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules for this first lecture on the first chapter, Chapter 2, on information ecosystems. And there'll be three basic ideas in this chapter that will receive illustration in a number of different ways. The first idea is the notion of an information imperative common to really almost all forms of life. And the idea is basic and straightforward. Life needs more than nutrients. It needs information in order to thrive, but especially to thrive. And I'll illustrate that in this lecture by considering examples of living creatures that we don't normally think of as trafficking much in information, and show how, in fact, that they do actually rely upon information to survive and or to thrive. So the first example that we'll look at is phototropism in plants. The second example that we'll look at is magnetotactic bacteria. And then we'll talk about what it is about human beings that makes them different from many forms of life, and what specifically differentiates human beings, given that their basic sensory systems, their ability to gather information through their senses, isn't really particularly admirable when taken in the larger context of those same kinds of systems in the wider animal world. The next concept that we want to talk about is an information ecosystem. And we'll give a basic definition of what it is to be an information ecosystem. And then we'll also talk about an information environment, giving a definition of that, and talking about the relationship between information ecosystems and an information environment. And then finally, we'll give a sort of brief history of the development of information ecosystems in living creatures, but particularly with a focus on human beings. So when you look at the history of life, what you discover is very early on, living creatures develop mechanisms for motility, but also mechanisms for irritability. So the ability to move around in the world and the ability to gather information about the world. And this is something that is really prevalent, much more prevalent than people appreciate. We normally think of plants, for instance, as needing light, and water, and soil, but plants also need information about their environment in order to better adapt to their situation, in order to survive or to thrive. And so our first example here is a movie taken from an old Britannica movie that talks about phototropism. That is the ability of plants to adjust the way in which they grow, the direction that they grow, in order to grow into better lighting conditions and away from poorer lighting conditions.
Growth in plants reflects the way in which they interact with the environment. If we place a strong light at one side of this fuchsia plant, the plant will grow towards it. This is called a phototrophic response. But what controls such a response? If the tip of the plant is protected from the light using a small cap, the plant will continue to grow upward. This suggests that there is something at the tip of the plant that controls the direction of growth. It is probable that all of these growth responses are due in some part to the auxin indole acetic acid, or IAA. One theory states that a light-sensing mechanism in the tip of the fuchsia plant promotes the active transport of IAM molecules to the shaded part of the stem. This action produces cell growth and elongation in this area. The result is a curvature which orientates the plant towards the light.
So the video illustrates that plants, creatures that aren't ambulatory, that don't have a central nervous system or even neurons, that aren't normally thought of as cognitive creatures at all, nevertheless do traffic to a certain degree in information. That is, they have mechanisms that are sensitive to features in their environment and that can result in adaptive responses by the plant to that environment to facilitate survival and thriving. In the case of phototropism specifically, plants have this mechanism that allows for differential growth in their stems in response to how much light those areas receive. And as a result, they can grow towards areas that have more light and away from shaded areas, and thereby increase their chances for surviving and thriving by increasing the amount of light they can utilize for photosynthesis. Our next example are magnetotactic bacteria. Now, creatures like magnetotactic bacteria have been around for a very, very long time, somewhere on the order of about 1.1 billion years in the fossil record at least. And so these bacteria are anaerobic bacteria, that is, oxygen-rich environments. Oxygen generally are toxic to these kinds of bacteria. They do not want to be in oxygen-rich environments. And so what we find is that these magnetotactic bacteria have developed a mechanism for irritability to the Earth's magnetic field, for sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic field, and then an ambulatory capacity to allow them to move using that knowledge about or information about the Earth's magnetic field to go away from surface water or silt that's more likely to be oxygen rich and downward towards water and silt that is much more likely to be oxygen poor and hence much more conducive to their survival and thriving. Now, how do they do that? Well, they grow these little ferrous compounds inside their bodies, little bits of iron essentially, which turn their bodies into compasses that are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. Using those ferrous globules inside their body, they're able to orient themselves relative to the Earth's magnetic field. Then they have a little imagination from their cell body called a flagellum that allows them to swim. Using their information about the Earth's magnetic field, they swim downward, away from surface water, and towards oxygen-poor environments where they're much more likely to survive and to thrive. In that video with its over-the-top soundtrack, what we see is a dish full of magnetotactic bacteria. Now, these magnetotactic bacteria are being tricked into thinking that magnetic north is changing position relative to where they are or where they're swimming. That's because there's a graduate student who is taking a powerful magnet that swamps the Earth's magnetic field, locally anyway, and moving it from one side of the dish to the other. The magnetotactic bacteria sense that change in the orientation they have to the magnetic field, and they adjust where they swim in response to that. Now, this illustrates an important feature of these simple biological, biochemical, mechanical mechanisms for sensitivity to environmental features. The magnetotactic bacteria wants to avoid oxygen, but it does no direct sensitivity to oxygen levels at all. Instead, it makes an indirect inference as to where oxygen-rich and poor environments are going to be based on its orientation to the Earth's magnetic field and where that magnetic field is relative to oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor environments. So they're not particularly sensitive to parameters. They're relatively rigid, and they can be easily fooled.